Good morning, good morning, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris Chan Quickie reading. And this morning, ladies and gentlemen, I know, actually trying to do videos in the morning has been very on and off for months, but here we are, and, well, I promised you guys that this was going to be a lot about Chris's religious beliefs, as we might say, and now we move on to a very fantasized version of Chris's perception, perhaps, of himself, and yet another cog in the wheel when it comes to Chris talking about his, let's call them what they are, delusions, but mostly orchestrated by the idea guys, but let's go through this. CPU Blueheart. The CPU Blueheart is the goddess of the Commodore gaming consoles and computers. The original, Scarlet, had served a very long time, until she had to pass on her powers and responsibilities onto Mama Chris-chan, who is the present CPU Blueheart, on top of her other responsibilities and duties. What these might be, or if they're any relation to what happens in the real world, your guess is as good as mine. But apparently that's literally the backstory as far as we know why CPU Blueheart came into being. There are, however, some things I do want to point out, because I know the lore and behind the Hyperdimension Neptunia video games quite well, so there are several comments I need to pass on in regards to this. Is that one, the reason it's not particularly heard of that actual CPUs actually passed on their powers to the next generation, or at least to those who were deemed worthy. Usually just what happens is that the source of, I think they were memory cores or CPU memories, is that they were just sort of randomly found by just people who just so happened to be walking around game industry at the time, and well, that's essentially the origins of their powers. Yeah, it's not exactly a very interesting backstory. I mean, anyone who's ever played the Hyperdimension Neptunia video games will know that's sort of how it works, because it was referenced in the third game, Rebirth 3, I should say, V Generation. It's the ordering for the series is a bit strange, but in the third game it was established that Plutia just so happened to find a memory core as it was just floating down a river, and she was just basically known as CPU Iris Heart. I don't know if it was meant to be for say a different version of the Sega game consoles, because one thing you're gonna have to keep in mind, I know I'm throwing a lot of lore in this, and we're only 3 minutes in, but the story of the third game is when the main character Neptune gets pulled into a different dimension, and some of the characters that do appear in this alternate dimension are basically the same as the ones in her homeland, but it's the problem with the third game is that it's basically just the story of the first game, except slightly different. There's not really too much to add, I suppose, when it comes to it's just they add things to things that we're already doing in 2 different games. Though one thing I will say about the third game, and it'll probably play in relation to this, is that it also ties in heavily to what happens into the fourth entrant, V2 generation, and I will just straight up state right now, and I'll just one moment, just 1 second. Is that I actually do own a copy of Hyperdimension. I don't know if this is meant to be they call this V2 or 7, because technically this is the 7th game in the franchise, if we're not counting the if we're not counting the spin-off games. But curiously enough, one thing you can actually kind of worth adding, I suppose, to this game is that a lot of the things that the idea guys they influence. Chris was very influenced by what the idea guys told them about the events that happen in Hyperdimension 7. But I'm not entirely convinced that, well, Chris has had it's actually a little bit more surprising that Chris hasn't had more time to actually ponder about other consoles he could just magically turn into gods. I mean, there was like the Super Famicom that I'm surprised. Well, actually, the Famicon's sort of been done. The Nintendo Switch has, well, it's mostly been done by characters in relation to Chris, and which actually, maybe that's the sort of thing we should continue with. So, CPU Blueheart, also known as Scarlet Celestia, is the console patron unit, goddess of the nations of Quickville and Comma. Why exactly they need to be a goddess of both places is a good question that doesn't really seem to fall in line, because Noir, all the rest of the CPUs in like the Hyperdimension Neptunia series are only really representative of like one console. Like you have Last Station, which is PlayStation, Louis, which is just meant to be like mostly the Nintendo Wii console. It's never really established if Last Station was meant to, Noir for Last Station is meant to be either the PS3 or the PS4. A lot of people suspect it's mostly meant to be for the PS3, I think, owing to when like the series began. And I can't quite remember the one for Vert, but she was basically for Xbox or something like that. Again, I don't exactly know how much of this I can really get into, because I haven't had anything to do with the series for a good few years now, and I'm not entirely convinced that it's that important. It's only really important in respect to those who know or sort of try to get an idea about what Chris is talking about. Because it would be very easy for me to say that I had absolutely no clue what Chris was talking about, and basically said that for the next 25 minutes. But no, there are actually some things about about Hyperdimension Neptunia I do know quite well, if a couple of years back. But let's keep going. Conceived by Chris after being force-fed Hyperdimension Neptunia lore by the Idea Guys, Scarlet serves as one of his escapist alter egos, providing a coping mechanism and enabling his messiah complex. Though through this alter ego, Chris also has emerged as the figurehead of the Dimensional Merge and his own group of worshippers. And what you're seeing right now, ladies and gentlemen, is technically how the CPU, well, in their CPU form, the characters in Hyperdimension Neptunia appear. They're mostly like scantily clad, but they do have like, they have attire that's a little bit more confined to that of actual combat, I guess you could say. They sometimes are accompanied with wings and sort of like tiaras, and it's, well, I know Chris is like drawing it. It looks as if Chris is like walking around on what looks like tiny little segments of a picket fence just painted blue. And the detailing just Chris decided to give to his trainers is like actually not bad, I suppose. But, well, yeah, okay. The Idea Guys and Hyperdimension Neptunia. Prior to the Idea Guys, Chris's mental health was already in a fragile state. A contemporary highlight was when he attended BronyCon in 2017 at the Grand Galloping Gala Ball. An attendant captured footage of Chris dancing by himself among the crowd. Yes, and if you... just to give you an idea, guys, is that it's, well... I'll just let this play out, because this is actually quite sad when you think about it. Well, I'll only play this one for a second. It's just there's Chris dancing by himself. And he's like, fake his dancing. You know, I know you keep seeing these things being popped up and all that, but if ever I was going to be sponsored by Avast or NordVPN, it's a good way to demonstrate how these things get to work. you could almost say from the very moment when when videos like that get put into place, is that the idea guys probably looked towards Chris and thought, we can make some money out of this. Disgusting. Yes, absolutely, and there's no other word for it. In his own retrospect, Chris remembers this ball for the passionate moments when he danced with his OC, Magi-chan. Also at this time, Chris was sowing the seeds of his belief in other dimensions, when he tweeted that life is a cartoon. Unfortunately, if Chris had anything to do with it, maybe the cartoon he was talking about was the cartoon Stressed Eric. If you've never seen that, it's probably for the best. It's not that good, unfortunately. Because the universe being created by a higher power is akin to Cartoon Network creating their own franchises. Yes, but unlike Cartoon Network, they won't just pull a show off the air for like 5 years, the backlash being so immense, and then they brought it back anyway. So a la Young Justice. Do you guys remember, like, back in the day when Young Justice only got 2 seasons and the outrage in the community was, like, so extreme that they literally were just, like, devoting days and days and days to, like, channels called, like, Young Justice deserves a 3rd season? Because, to be fair, Young Justice was awesome anyway, but this, it's very, very interesting. Like, I wonder if anybody's ever posed the question to Chris about what cartoon did he have in mind. It was in what was likely the first sign of Chris being manipulated by the idea guys. In early November 2017, Chris posted a plea for prayers for the CPUs as Quickville had been invaded by the villains of game industry. Filling in the blanks, Chris claimed he was briefly possessed, a representation of CPU Orange Heart Uzume Tenobushi, after laying his hands on the supercharged Sega Dreamcast. Now endowed with the abilities of a goddess, he travelled to his fantasy world to save the day. Which, yes, by the way, okay, once again I have to interject is that in here's the thing, Hyperdimension Neptunia 7 is technically also 3 games. The thing to note is that it's basically it's sort of the same story, except it's cut into 3 segments. And the first segment of like that game is specifically Neptune and Nepgear having travelled all the way to an alternate version of game industry, which coincidentally was also by the access of a Sega Dreamcast, proving that Chris literally will just chew up anything he gets told and literally regurgitate it almost exactly the way it went in. And yeah, that's basically the whole story, is that they went in there and they had to save the day, and also CPU Orange Heart was there. I know, again, to the people that care, I suppose this is what it is. And well, I suppose, well, actually, before we go any further, I want to show you guys, this is sort of how Chris envisions it, because this is more or less how the events of Neptunia 7 began. Is that this is Chris and Chris and Magi-chan all told about the Sega Dreamcast, and Chris becomes endowed with the powers of it, and then the CPU Orange Heart just sort of like appears over the shoulder. Then, of course, you get a bit of an interesting like plot point for like, again, for those who care, again, is that there was like an alternate version of Neptune who's like much older and subsequently a lot taller, and it almost looks as though she's not really wearing any pants, but, well, tell Chris that, not me. And this is this meant to be Sylvana, or like, I can't quite sure. Are you okay, Neptune? And then blah blah, armies attack. Chris somehow becomes like intellectually aware of Last Station. You know what? I'm gonna look up actually what was the what was like the Xbox patrons of like. No, it's not on Xbox. That's not what I was wanting to know. Okay, and by the way, it's the series is even still going on to this day. Interesting. lean box. Wow, that couldn't be any more on the nose if you tried. And yeah, that's more or less Chris always tried to like regurgitate the events of the first third of the game, I suppose. Anyway, in what was likely first, after laying his hands on the supercharged Sega Dreamcast, now endowed with the abilities of a goddess, he travelled to his fantasy world to save the day. The following month, Chris introduced Battery Charge Hard, the CPU of Quickville, and the Smack Z consoles. I have absolutely no idea. What exactly is the Smack Z consoles? Not found. Okay, that's... I never would have guessed otherwise. According to Chris, he devised the character to prayerfully end the war with Australia and restore Quickville. But in his lore, the character proved to be a hindrance to the war. The reign of the idea guys would cease around April of 2018. However, the outlandish concept they instilled into Chris would lay the foundations for Sonichu issue 13, which would be completed that August. It is clear that Chris intended Battery Charge Hard to be his own Hyperdimension Neptunia CPU in the Sonichu franchise. But with this liberation from the idea guys, he would eventually push his character to the sidelines. The awakening of a CPU. And one thing to note is, again, this is basically issue 13 of Sonichu, but because of how controversial Sonichu issue 13 is that this was not technically uploaded to Patreon because they would have taken this back down immediately, which, considering the amount of NSFW content creators that are on Patreon, that's saying something. I have lived a long, tiring, and mentally and emotionally enduring life. Made my own progress, recovery, and whatnot. Me, a half Sonichu individual of this Earth 1218, destined to be a console patron unit. The epilogue to Sonichu issue 13. Well, Chris has led an enduring life. Is that worth it? On the 14th of June 2018, Chris uploaded 2 videos requesting the help of a local technician to repair his Commodore 64, as a topic he rarely touches upon. Chris discussing computer hardware was somewhat out of the ordinary, even for him. According to Sonichu issue 13, which at this point of the series acts as a pseudo-biography for him to chronicle his coping mechanisms, on the 16th of June 2018, it was a prophesized event, in which Chris received the soul and in turn the memories of the abilities of Scarlet, upon touching his aforementioned Commodore 64. Furthermore, the prophecy elaborated that Scarlet's rebirth serves to oppose the return of Neptunia and Sonichu issue 12-9, villain Ray writes, accompanied by a dreaded, fictitious Atari VCU console. For several weeks, Chris would remain vague about his newfound alter ego. Nearly 2 weeks later, Chris unveiled Scarlet/CPU Blueheart, another OC based on Hyperdimension Neptunia. He followed up by posting screenshots of text messages between him and another person on Facebook, which detailed notes on Scarlet. The following is an excerpt. Her name is Scarlet, aka Blueheart, and she ruled over the nation of Comma. It was a very prosperous nation, like the others of game industry. Then in 1992, like Tari, it fell, but instead of being lost, it crashed into an unoccupied area in northern West Virginia. Everyone survived the impact. I find that hard to believe. Then the citizens were, in and out, free to see the rest of the US and take in other cultures and religions. But shares dropped for Scarlet and she passed on in 1994, but her soul and memories were sent into a Commodore 64 console in this world, waiting to be bestowed to the next Blueheart. I have heard that those memories have been bestowed recently to a woman who has owed the very same C64 console since the early 1980s. Despite being defunct since 1994, Chris went on in great detail to describe the next system for Commodore, if there were anything like the Amiga CD CD32, I can only assume that there was no future whatsoever for Commodore, since, by the way, Commodore mostly started life out as like building computers, and then they sort of like moved into like video game production. And by the way, for anyone who's actually ever played an Amiga CD32, it's not particularly very difficult to understand about where it went wrong, because the CD32 was like twice the price of any other console available at the time. In fact, even with modern prices right now, it would still cost more than a PlayStation 5. Yikes. Which would be called the Commodore QUIC, or Commodore CU. In his correspondence, among other posts in July, Chris referred to an unnamed female who was the recipient of Scarlett's essence. In summary, Chris believed that the second coming of a fictional character of his own design would act in tandem with the return of a computer manufacturer which hasn't existed in decades. Finally, on the 3rd of August 2018, Chris announced on Twitter that he was the new CPU Blue Heart candidate he previously alluded to, when he published the short prose, The Awakening of a CPU, aka The Idea Guy Corruptions, which would finalize his work on the Sonichu issue 13 comic. I suppose on the mention of that, and my hubby Magi-chan told me now was the time. I, Mrs. Christine Weston Chandler, Sonichu, am the new CPU Blue Heart. And immediately, this is like sort of, I remember, wasn't it like either Kim Wilson or Jessica Quinn, literally the first thing they like commented was, what? Because I don't really think people understood what Chris was talking about, or couldn't even fathom what was even going on, which isn't exactly, again, out of the ordinary when it comes to Chris, but this is like, what is he babbling on about now? Moving forward, he urged his followers to spread the gospel of the CPU Blue Heart. As noted in his lore, Chris can transform into a CPU form as instantly as shouting "Access." He can also transform into CPU version of his Chris-chan Sonichu persona when not body swapping with Sonichu or Magi-chan. Chris usually caps off his online posts with the emojis lightning, heart, lightning, representing his signature as CPU Blue Heart. Much like the infamous unicorn cosplay, Chris has introduced another element currently dictating his life to his attire, this time his CPU status. For the duration of BronyCon 2019, Chris's cosplay included a metal wire on his forehead, controlled to resemble the Commodore logo. Back at home, Chris's engagement as CPU Blue Heart has also drawn him closer to his interest in pseudoscience, with his use of magical tools such as wands and crystal-based devices, to enhance his CPU abilities. Though, to be fair, again, considering what we know about Chris was buying towards the end of his tenure at 14 Branch Lane Court, we can only hazard a guess that Chris was buying very different sort of wands, and maybe very different crystal-based devices, but that's only my speculation through evidence. Supposedly not to break his immense role-playing, Chris has not stated why he chose the Commodore 64 when he has owned several gaming platforms in his lifetime. Though the C64 has been known to hold sentimental value for Chris, as it was his childhood computer and a hobby when he bonded with his father over. The life as a goddess. Chris-chan Sona-chan is watching over you. What Chris said to a woman going through a divorce. Yeah, so again, I'm just going to re-emphasize, just because it's important to bring this up, is that if you do genuinely think that Chris has the authority to say so, well, it's not really a question of authority, it's just the fact that Chris is just an idiot, and he thinks that he has more power and authority than he realizes. So there's that. Since at least October of 2018, Chris's main vocation as CPU Blue Heart is to act as the overseer of the dimensional merge, in which our Dimension 1218 will combine with Dimension C197, the realm of most fictional franchises, which would bring the creations into our reality. Having stated that people would integrate with their fictional self-counterparts, Chris implies that he would have full reign of his goddess powers upon completion of the merge. On paper, it sounds like the draft of a Roger Rabbit-style blockbuster. But in actuality, Chris comes off as a bargain bin Harold Camping, with further comparison to the Evangelist when the merge failed to occur on the 1st of January 2019. Chris simply recalculated his pending day of judgment. As of present day, the merge has yet to be manifested. And when we actually talk about the merge in its entirety, you know it never will, and people need to learn to, even I would say to stop mentioning it. But we'll get to that. In the other days of Chris's God Quest, he received a number of tributes in the form of artworks of his characters. One of which was a drawing of a thick CPU Blueheart, which left him especially smiteful that day, declaring that Scarlet was not fat, and he is not fat either. As the final nail in the coffin of finding employment, Chris started citing his responsibilities as a goddess as sufficient reason for not needing a job. Though, to be fair, the fact that people thought he was ever getting a job... Oh, by the way, for what they're worth, I suppose, well, if we're going through the begging counter, it's been 149 days since Chris last begged for money, and the record streak was 989 days. It's also been 213 days since Chris last uploaded pages to meet his formally paid obligations to the Solitude comic. The record for that is 1,633 days, and Chris was getting paid to basically sit on his arse doing nothing. And it's also been 5,294 days since Chris last applied for a job. And before this month is over, ladies and gentlemen, it will topple into 5,301. That is... If Chris wasn't going to bother doing it before, what makes you think he's going to start doing for it now? He has yet to use his divine powers to conjure up the six-figure sum for his family that he owes to various creditors, but has assured a paycheck of tenfold once the merge has completed. I am employed by Emmanuel, this world's god, Scarlet, the original CPU Blueheart of the Commodore consoles, the chaotic rainbow that sent me to be born in this 1218 to find my guided paths. What qualifies me? I am very well motivated and mentally, emotionally, soulfully driven. So nothing actually to require from actual skills or anything like that. Yeah, Scarlet could have been talking out of her arse saying that she prevented an entire war, but, you know, details like that probably should be commonplace in these sorts of descriptions, but, well, considering that the majority of people in Quickville have no choice anyway, well, what do you expect? I had and have awesome teachers and guides throughout my life who showed me not only the basics, but the metaphysical advanced, due to my blessed born abilities and powers, and then some. That's not a personal statement, ladies and gentlemen. That's not even an open letter. That's just a bunch of bullshit that Chris thinks sounds important and stuff that people as simple as Chris are able to understand. And by the way, speaking of things that Chris absolutely wants people to understand, in his attempts to persuade Hasbro to continue Friendship is Magic, he frequently invoked his CPU status. Notably with the airing of MLP spin-off Pony Life, Chris, possessed by Sonichu, used the CPU-appropriate blasphemy. Oh my Chris-chan, to express his sheer disappointment with the show. With several members of the Brony analyst community blocked Chris over a short period of time, Chris created his current Twitter handle CPU_QuickSonichu in order to reconnect with his blockers and reduce Ween activity, effectively making his original account redundant. In a more bizarre coping mechanism, Chris created a self-insert Lego parody of one of his favourite Brony analysts, which features minifigure Chris accessing his CPU form. Now, I'm not entirely sure about, like, if I ought to do a video about that. Well, I probably am, but do I want to do it with the other videos I wanted to release today? Probably not, but, well, it's just, it's a way of Chris sort of like coming to terms with the fact that he doesn't really know how to handle the situation. And he only does this by trying to demonstrate that to people that he thinks he does, but we all know he doesn't. Devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu. In November 2019, Chris steered a post of Christorians towards brainstorming his own religious following. He named his worshippers Devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu, or DOCS, favoured over the derivative but potential Quickenism as the name of his religion. And by the way, these are the things that Chris wants you to believe that he is in worship of, from Christianity, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Commodore. One of these things is, not like the others. Bottom line, you all, my followers and worshippers, do have a choice to call your group as you will. Just Quickans, pronounced Quickans, and practicing Quickenism pronounces Quickanism, that does not feel or sound fitting to me and feels off. So Chris went from, you're free to do as you wish, but no, we're not playing by that. So Chris just lying, as we know Chris is always one to do. I believe I may have the proper term. Going from worshipper, I checked the thesaurus devotee in the term sounds better. Devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu, DOCS. This is my better educates and thought suggestion. Okay. It was also around this time when Chris consecrated his home of 14 Branch Lane Court, now bearing the title of Temple of Christine Western Chandler Sonichu. Unfortunately for the goddess and an avid Pokemon Go player, his place of worship was not hallowed enough to be accepted as a Pokestop. Chris's preference for the philosophic term devotee instead of worshipper stands in contrast to Chris's more overtly religious calls for his followers to have faith in all the OCs and all the deities, as in his video, Believe in the OCs and Deities. As part of his new pet project, Chris commemorated his religious sect when he designed a set of Twilight Sparkle secret shipfic folder cards based on his following. These included the quote-unquote temple of 14 Branch Lane Court, which is literally the front of Chris's house, taken from at least 2020, and, well, you could just see from the outset as well as that the greenhouse look as though it hasn't been, like, emptied out for years. There isn't really that much trash, like, as opposed to, trash cans, I suppose, like, lying out the front. But as you can see, things seem to have been, like, overgrown at the side. The hedges look to be in an almost disgraceful condition. And, well, it looks as if, like, the front has just been, like, neglected, or just maybe so much trash was dumped on here for years that it caused, like, the earth to turn brown. Simply put, this is the good old house of Chris Chan Sonichu. Originally built in Dimension 1218, this house yard and its gazebo and sheds have been between 1218 and C197 a lot. This house and yard are a central between the two dimensions, 14 Branch Lane Court, because, anyone who wanted to actually put out, a card game would absolutely think it would be a good idea to dox themselves. Well, Chris was the one who coined the phrase, so we can't exactly be surprised. By the way, this is also the gazebo that looks like it hasn't been... Chris could have just swept this out and it would have been fine. Innocent-looking old gazebo. I don't exactly know how a gazebo can be innocent, but, well, I suppose if there was anything to call this. And also the devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu from... Steve, oh yeah, this is right. This is meant to be the couple that granted Chris the Nintendo Switch. So, I will get to a video talking about this where I know that, you know, is it Sarah and Steve or something like that were the ones who gave Chris the Switch. And, well, I'll talk about that video separately, but I think it's, like, worth getting into because Chris does some really dumb things in that as well, but things that shouldn't come as a surprise. In the comics, in Chris's addendum to Sonic 2 issue 13, he explains that the destructive impact of the Idea Guys only strengthened his connection to the sister dimension, which in turn led to Chris fulfilling his prophecy of taking on the mantle of CPU Blueheart. In Sonic 2 issue 14, the introduction summarizes Chris's journey to becoming a CPU goddess, and he equates the reader with his role in the upcoming dimensional merge crossout plot device. Meanwhile, while working on the construction of the Quickfill Basilicom, Chris's share site is activated by an ally named Beth Stevenson, which is never addressed henceforth. In Chris's dream, Chris and Magi-chan discover a room with a large round table, with a throne assigned to each deity/CPU. Without Chris working on the comic books to publish further pages, the rest of the comic does not address anything of a CPU nature. Because I don't really know why it would, but there you are. Also, the only thing to worth note is that this is just a gallery of like art Chris did, which he included a minifigure, and then of course did things like, again, this is the wire Commodore logo that Chris just put onto his head and went out in public with this, as well as a multitude of rocks, his medallion, plenty of rings, and, well, you gotta wonder how Chris was able to cope with carrying basically an excessive amount of weight around with him, even more than normal. And there's just about other things else as well. And this is, by the way, this is somebody's fan art that Chris, like, lambasted because they thought that it made Chris Scholar look too fat. Which, again, this is... Chris lambasting people's artwork is not new, but I thought this was actually quite well done, to be honest. But what can I say? Again, I don't follow this sort of thing, but apparently this is the sort of thing that Chris thinks is absolutely fine, I suppose. I'm not entirely sure if Chris ever made a thing commenting about this work itself, but there you are. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that was the entire discussion of Chris as a CPU. It's nonsense, I know, and you may argue that Chris needed somebody to actually believe in, or someone that actually mirrors all of Chris's perfections as he sees it, but as we see it, it's once again another way of Chris to try and process in the mind that his life is completely down the tube, and that the only way to resemble anything outside of a success in his life is by conjuring up stories that will make him look successful in the eyes of those he still wants people to care for, and it's inflated his ego to such an extent that the word humble is just sort of thrown out of the dictionary altogether, and Chris now thinks he could concede the idea of being worshipped and followed, despite the fact that people aren't really doing it. People are only just doing it just to see how far Chris can go with it, even though nobody suspected how far Chris would go in regards to his own mother, but, well, that's sort of how that is. We might have to cover a little bit more about this when we come to when Chris refers to himself as Jesus Christ, but Jesus Christ, what a headache that's going to be. And I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.